Hey there, I'm Jordan Lapierre, host of This Week in Immigration. Just a heads up before we get into the show. We recorded this episode on Friday, June 15th, as details were still emerging about the pending House vote on DACA. We've made every effort to stay as up-to-date as possible. Okay, here's the show. Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our conversation on the stories that matter right now in immigration policy. I'm Jordan Lapierre. This week on the program, DACA's day in the House is coming up, and so too is its day in court. The latest decisions on who's eligible for asylum and the impacts on families at the border, and border apprehension numbers are on the rise again. All that just ahead. But before we start, remember, subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org. And while you're there, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. All right, let's get into it. Here today, as usual, are Theresa Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
Cris Ramon, Policy Analyst.
How are you doing today?
And Laura Hall, Senior Manager at BBC Action.
Hi, Jordan.
The big news as we sit here today, House Speaker Paul Ryan has unveiled a so-called compromise bill on DACA that comes out of negotiations between conservative and moderate Republicans. Theresa, what's in the new bill?
Well, it is a big bill. It's almost 300 pages, and it's a mixture of a lot of different things. Many of the pieces that the president had said he wanted to see in an immigration bill. It does obviously help DACA recipients and dreamers, but it also contains a lot of stuff that the conservatives would like. So, for example, it would fully fund the president's border wall to the tune of $25 million, to $25 billion, with a B, big number. It also authorizes the use of National Guard at the border and supports other border technology and infrastructure systems at the border. It also includes an awful lot of the interior enforcement related provisions the president has said he wanted, so-called closing of loopholes at the border, many of which were in another bill that might be voted on next week by Chairman Goodlatte. And that includes increasing the standards for asking for asylum in the United States. It would increase the ability of DHS to detain immigrant families who are apprehended at the border. It would allow for the expedited removal of unaccompanied children who apply at the border without necessarily going through immigration court. It also deals with interior enforcement issues, such as making ICE detainer requests mandatory for sanctuary cities, increasing the penalties for illegal reentry, allowing for deportation of gang members. But the most interesting thing, probably the new thing about this bill, is what it does with the legal immigration system. So as I mentioned, it would allow DACA recipients and another group of what I call age-out kids, and I'll explain that in a minute, to gain legal status by reducing the family-based immigration process for adult married children of U.S. citizens and siblings of U.S. citizens, reallocating those visas to a new green card category based on points that the DACA recipients and these other kids could access. In the meantime, they'd have a conditional non-immigrant status, something similar to DACA that they have now, that would allow them to stay and work in the United States. That's probably the biggest change. What I meant about these age-out kids, this is a new group we haven't talked much about, so I'll explain it.
Yeah.
When people come here on longer-term work or student visas or investor visas that are not green cards but temporary, so H-1B visas, L visas, the so-called E-visa, which is for people who come and work in an investment or trade business, they can be here in the United States for upwards of 10 or 12 years. Many of them come with young kids and their kids grow up here. But once the children reach age 21, they're no longer eligible to essentially tag along on their parents' coat heels on their visa status, and they have to find another visa or they become undocumented. So a lot of the high-tech community especially employs a lot of these workers, and many other businesses have supported this because when the kids no longer have status, a lot of those parents then want to leave. So this bill allows them also to get this conditional non-immigrant status and future green cards, recognizing that they're in a somewhat similar position to the Dreamers in that they've grown up here, they just happen to grow up mostly in a legal status.
So let's compare this compromise bill with the other one that looks like it's going to get a vote in the House. And that's the one sponsored by, as you said, Virginia Republican Bob Goodlatte, What are the key differences between these two proposals?
So the main difference on the DACA side is that the Goodlatte bill does not have a pathway to permanent residence, and it doesn't have a pathway to citizenship. For the DACA individuals, and it would just apply to those who currently have DACA status, it basically would create a legislative version of DACA that would allow them to continue to indefinitely ask for a 6-year temporary stay status. It would not provide a way to get a green card. It would not provide a way to get citizenship, and it's for a much smaller number of people. One of the other major differences is that the Goodlatte bill also deals with the agricultural community by creating a new agricultural temporary worker visa. Many in the agriculture community have been divided about whether or not they think that provision is workable for them. So it's been a bit controversial. But the Goodlatte bill also would mandatory nationwide electronic employment verification. So all employers would be required to check the status of every worker. And right now, that's only required on a voluntary basis, although some states do mandate it. So those provisions are not in this compromise bill. In addition, the Goodlatte bill constrains legal immigration more than the compromise bill. In addition to the family categories that the compromise bill eliminates, the Goodlatte bill also eliminates parents of U.S. citizens. It also eliminates ability of green card holders to sponsor their adult unmarried children, and for U.S. citizens to sponsor their adult unmarried children. So much stronger restrictions on future family-based immigration. Both bills would eliminate the diversity category.
Laura, I want to turn to you for some of the procedural details. Yep. Speaker Ryan says he's going to bring up both of these bills for consideration in the next week or so. What can you tell us about the timeline as we know it so far?
Right. Well, I can tell you that Republicans are whipping both of these measures as we speak. What that means is that House leadership and their deputies are going member to member and pressuring them to share where they stand on each of the bills. A whip operation is essentially an intelligence gathering operation. It tells them where their caucus stands on each of the measures and gives them a sense of where support or opposition lies. They then use that information to count up the numbers and see if they have enough support for either one to advance, or if there's more work to be done to the proposals to get them in a place where they can gain majority support. Despite some of the chatter we've heard, there is no guarantee that either one of these proposals will see the light of day. If the whip operation shows that there isn't enough support behind either measure, they could scrap the entire debate. Leadership of
really? So to be clear, there's no guarantee that there's going to be a vote.
There is no guarantee. I mean, leadership sets what comes to the floor. In either party, whether the Republicans are in charge or the Democrats are in charge, leadership doesn't like surprises. They like to know if they bring something to the floor, kind of what the fate's going to be, how the debate's going to unfold, whether they can get something off the floor. They don't like to put something on the floor and see it fail, unless maybe there's a strategic reason for them to do so. So today's pretty critical to determine what happens in the next couple days on this debate.
So moderate Republicans had been joining with Democrats on the so-called discharge petition that would have forced votes on several DACA bills. What are those moderate Republicans saying now about the path forward? Are they satisfied with this new plan?
My sense is that they are. They're generally pleased with Speaker Ryan's proposal. They were heavily involved in its drafting. Do they think it's perfect? I'm sure they don't. But my sense is that they think it's a step in the right direction. They want to have this debate. They want to be able to bring something to the floor. So I think that they are probably pretty pleased with that. Democrats, on the other hand, who were kind of the other group that were involved in the discharge petition effort, have expressed frustration with how this all unfolded. I'm not sure you'll get any Democrats supporting either one of these measures. If you go back to what I talked about, the whip operation and just doing the simple math, I'm just not sure how they get enough votes for either one of these to move forward if the Democrats are kind of sitting out as a bloc.
Where does this leave the discharge petition? Is it dead at this point?
I guess there's always a chance someone could re-up it and try and do, restart it but I think that for now, the debate over these two measures is kind of where the House is going on this.
So, but to be clear, if the discharge petition effort picks back up, they don't start back at zero, right? Those signatures are still
they're still valid. I think some members have expressed a desire to maybe unsign the discharge petition, and some members that maybe said they would sign are waffling a little bit. I think their numbers are a little bit up in the air.
Okay. So what do we know about the rules under which these two bills will be considered if they do come to the floor? Do we expect that there's going to be a straight up or down vote, or is there going to be a chance for members to offer some amendments?
What we've heard from leadership is that it's going to be two bills, 4 votes essentially. The rule and then the actual text of legislation for the Goodlatte bill, the rule and the actual text of legislation for Speaker Ryan. So the rule is kind of the procedural vote that allows debate to move forward in them to move to the next bill. I don't think that they will structure it in a way that amendments will be allowed. My sense is that if they bring this to the floor, this is what it is, understanding that over the next couple of days they could make tweaks that, what we've seen so far doesn't necessarily have to be the bill that comes out next week. I think there's opportunities to tweak between now and then. I don't think they'll want to do tweaks on the floor.
All right, so I guess I'll put this question to both you, Laura, and you, Theresa. The real question is, does all this drama amount to anything? Can either of these bills pass the House?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is it's a pretty uphill battle.
Yeah.
I have a hard time seeing either one of these advancing. The Goodlatte bill, I think, isn't palatable enough to moderates, and certainly not the Democrats, for that to get enough votes to get 218. If maybe there was a Herculean effort over the weekend to get the Ryan bill in a place where Democrats could come on board, or even some of the more conservative groups. You have the news this morning that Donald Trump won't sign the compromise bill into law. So it kind of sticks us in a tough spot.
Yeah, I think there was always a question, even if they did pass something up the House, whether the Senate would take it up. And obviously the Democrats have enough votes in the Senate to stymie legislation if they so choose. And they, again, reminder, Democrats were not involved in the negotiation of this compromise bill as well, at all, right? The compromise is between two wings of the Republican Party, not a compromise between Republicans and Democrats. So it's not a bipartisan bill.
Right.
And so the idea that Democrats would be on board with this is kind of, I don't think that's likely. It's unrealistic.
When they didn't have a seat at the table.
And now the president's saying that the only bill that he's willing to support is Goodlatte, and we know Goodlatte doesn't have the votes. So that essentially means there's not a legislative vehicle right now. We'll have to see what happens after that.
Okay, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thanks.
Thanks, Laura.
No problem. Thank you, guys.
Sticking with DACA now, we spoke a couple of weeks ago about a federal court case in Texas that could force the Trump administration to end the DACA program, even while other federal judges have ordered the program continued for now. The Justice Department has taken the unusual step of essentially saying it agrees with the states that are suing it. Theresa, can you explain this recent decision and what it means for the case moving forward?
Sure. Just to recap, there have been two nationwide injunctions, one in New York and one in California, that ordered the Trump administration to continue receiving applications for renewal of DACA status until the merits of the case that was brought against the administration can be heard. So that is why the DACA program is still essentially in existence right now. However, about a month or two ago, several of the more conservative states, led by Texas, who sued the Obama administration over its expansion of the DACA program and the DAPA program for parents of U.S. citizens, went back to that same judge in the Southern District of Texas, Judge Hannon, and asked to have the DACA program itself declared illegal. What happened is this week the Department of Justice filed its response to that suit, and they agreed with the plaintiffs in the case, with the state of Texas and the others, that the DACA program, as it was created by President Obama, was not legal, that it exceeded the president's authority. They argued that they did have the right to wind it down, but that the program itself should end now. But they issued an unusual plea to the judge. They normally have said, and Attorney General Sessions has said a lot, that they don't like nationwide injunctions. They don't like the idea that one judge in one part of the country can issue an injunction that applies everywhere in the country. And so they've argued against this, but they asked the judge in this case to say, if you issue an injunction saying we have to end the program, we wouldn't necessarily object to that, but we'd ask you to stay that injunction for a little while, because then we can take your injunction and these other two injunctions and appeal to the Supreme Court. Because you'd have an unusual circumstance of actually 100% conflicting nationwide injunctions that the government cannot honor both. And that would be unique. We haven't seen that, certainly in the immigration space before, and it does set up a very interesting conversation for the Supreme Court to listen to.
Do you see any way that this whole thing ends without what you just described, without this heading to the Supreme Court at one point or another?
I don't think so. I mean, the classic case of the Supreme Court weighing in is when you have decisions that come out of different district courts or appeals courts in the country that have conflicting outcomes, right? And so that's exactly when the Supreme Court is supposed to weigh in, to sort of adjudicate between these conflicting legal opinions and decide what's going to be the law of the land. So this is basically, the Department of Justice is setting this up to be that kind of case so that the Supreme Court can issue sort of a once and for all decision. And the decision may be not just on the merits of the DACA program itself and whether or not it was legal, whether or not this administration had the authority to end it, but they will probably ask the Supreme Court to weigh in on this issue of nationwide injunctions as well. And so that would be interesting. The timing is also interesting. The hearings on this in the schedule in the Texas court are that we could have a decision from that judge, and they could take this to the Supreme Court as early as July. So going back to what we just talked about, Congress may not act this week or next on these bills that have been introduced, but if over the summer the courts weigh in and end the program for good, there may be renewed impetus on Congress to get back to the table and try again.
Or the converse is that, as we've talked about quite a bit in the past, yet again, immigration policy is made by the courts and not the legislature.
Right. The other thing is the Supreme Court could say, well, you have to continue the program, or it was legal, or any number of things. But I think given the conservative majority on the Supreme Court right now, a lot of people are afraid that they would rule in favor of the administration ending the program.
So where's your sense of where this leaves the DACA program right now?
Well, I would say that if I were somebody who has DACA right now, I'd be extremely concerned and anxious because Congress doesn't seem to be able to pass a permanent protection. The courts are weighing in ways that make the future of the program really questionable, and there's no guarantee that they're going to have any status 2 years out in the future. That's a very hard way to live.
Okay, thanks, Theresa. Turning to the border, we've talked in recent weeks about family separation and detentions as a result of the decision to enforce a zero-tolerance policy on illegal border crossings. You can also check out our recent explainer on the topic at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Today, though, I want to dive into one aspect of that unfolding story, and that's a decision by Attorney General Jeff Sessions that impacts immigrants fleeing domestic violence and criminal gangs who are seeking asylum. So, Theresa, what did Attorney General Sessions decide on this?
Sure. So the Attorney General referred to himself a case from the Board of Immigration Appeals called Matter of AB, in which an individual, a woman who was a victim of domestic violence, requested asylum. And in that case, the board affirmed that cases where a woman has suffered domestic violence and the country that she is from has been unable to protect her, she becomes part of a social group called Women Who Are Victims of Domestic Violence, and that the lack of ability of her government to protect her from that is grounds for asylum. The Attorney General essentially overruled that decision in another similar case and said that this isn't what the asylum rules were made for. They were made for situations that didn't really involve private violence like this. It was mostly about state-sanctioned or state-sponsored persecution of well-known and what he would call obvious groups, people with immutable characteristics like their race or their nationality or their religion, that were under threat from a government or a governmental entity. So he basically overturned these cases that had been allowing particularly Central American victims of domestic violence to apply for asylum in this country.
So let's back up, though, because there is an immigration court system and immigration judges who rule in cases like this. Does the Attorney General have the ability to just make these unilateral decisions and go outside those normal procedures and processes?
Well, technically, yes. So as we said before, and just to remind everybody, the immigration court system is an administrative system that is administered by the Department of Justice. So all of the immigration judges are employees of the Department of Justice, and the Attorney General is their boss. And the appeals board for immigration court judges, the Board of Immigration Appeals, is also a body of the Department of Justice, and they are their overseer is the Attorney General. So under immigration law, the Attorney General does have the right to refer to himself cases that have been ruled on by the immigration judges or the board. He can review them, he can overturn them, and he can make his own decisions precedent, which means that they are now binding on all future cases that the immigration judges decide, and on asylum cases that the DHS asylum officers decide.
So what does all this then mean for future asylum applicants? It sounds like it would be a lot harder for many people to get a ruling in their favor.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of detail in this decision, including a bunch of footnotes that have implications beyond just domestic violence victims. The decision talks about this expansion of the idea of who is a particular social group that may be subject to persecution, and says normally it's not just people in like circumstances. It has to be something about them specifically, and that the abuse or violence that they suffered had to be on account of that characteristic. They also was very clear that he did not believe that generally just because somebody suffers violence from an individual or even a criminal gang in a country would necessarily count as persecution, when there's not a lot of evidence that the government is just completely unable to help them, or there's not another place they can go. And he also, through a footnote, kind of reset the standard for the threshold interview, saying that in general, the credible fear interview, which is the first step in the process toward applying asylum, where an asylum officer listens to the story and says, do we find it credible? The Attorney General said most cases based on similar facts to this, there should not be a credible fear finding. So what this will mean is that individuals, particularly a lot of the Central American women and families that we're seeing coming to the border right now and applying for asylum, would have a much harder time proving their case, and many fewer of them will be actually probably able to have the chance to plead that case before an immigration judge.
And those Central American women and families that are showing up and asking for asylum and not in the future not receiving it, what happens to the children in those cases?
Well, again, this goes back to the policy that we have in place right now, the zero tolerance policy. If they're coming in between the ports of entry, the government is still prosecuting the adults in criminal court, separating the children from the parents during that process. The children would go through their own immigration process, but again, the children would probably have a harder time claiming asylum in immigration court. The parents, particularly if they're women and they're claiming asylum based on one of these grounds, would also have a harder time. So my guess is that more people would just be deported back.
Okay, thanks, Theresa. Finally today, as we hear stories about shelters and detention centers at the southern border filling up, let's get a little perspective on the number of people trying to cross the border illegally. Cris Ramon, policy analyst, is here. Cris, what are the latest numbers on apprehensions at the U.S.-Mexico border?
Right. So what you've seen is, last month in May had 50,000 people arrested at the border, which is a 38th straight increase this month. And this is really important because the administration is sort of painting this as a crisis in the border that needs tougher border security measures to deter this. But if you compare this to sort of the historical numbers, I don't think it's necessarily that's the case.
So how can we sort of point to a trend line or sort of compare this with past years?
So it's really a question of how you're framing the numbers and the time frame that you're looking at. So if you're comparing between 2017 and 2018, there is an increase. 2017 you saw historic levels of drop-offs in border apprehensions. But then if you look at 2018, it seems like things have increased. So you compare May 2017 to May 2018, you saw an increase of 178%. But that's if you're comparing 2017, which is, like I said, historically low, compared to 2014, 2015, 2016, where you saw similar levels. And then if you start taking a step back, you start going from 2005, you essentially started seeing a really significant drop in border apprehensions. You take it back to the 90s, this trend has been dropping off significantly. So the administration is kind of trying to paint this as a crisis, but the thing is, if you're comparing it to historical precedents, it's just kind of getting back up to the numbers where they've been over the last 5 years. And if you compare that to where it's been over the last 15 to 20 years, you've been seeing, it's along the trend lines of things dropping off significantly.
Interesting. So it's sort of about where you set your baseline for what we consider to be a normal amount of border crossings.
Exactly.
And the administration much touted the lower numbers of illegal crossings last year and said, illegal immigration is way down, and this year maybe it's just floating back up to what we would consider a more normal trend.
Exactly. In December, I wrote a blog post about the latest numbers, and the administration was really touting the border apprehension figures by the end of 2017 is really a major accomplishment, a huge significant drop-off. But the question is, as I wrote then, and I think a lot of people were saying is, we talked about the Trump effect, that one of the reasons things dropped off over 2017 is that people were sort of afraid of the Trump administration having stronger enforcement policies, his rhetoric having an impact on this drop. But then the question was, is this going to last through 2018? It's looking like it's not.
And certain months produce more illegal crossings than others, right? So what are we looking at for what are the months of the year when we see the most crossings traditionally?
Typically, you don't see a lot of crossings over in the winter. I mean, just due to the conditions that if you're at least if you're crossing from, say, a lot of folks are fleeing Central America and fleeing the violence there, particularly women and children and families. Crossing through Mexico in the winter months is going to be significantly harder, but then there's sort of the period in spring through sort of midsummer where you see more people crossing, but then, they're crossing deserts, and so by around August you see a drop off, maybe a little bit of a pickup in the fall, but it's all really dependent on sort of the temperature and the conditions with which they're crossing.
Got it. So what do you see in these numbers that tells us about the Trump administration's efforts to use the family separation that we've talked about as a way to deter people from entering illegally?
So that's the big question, right? What does this mean? I think obviously it remains to be seen how this policy will influence border apprehensions numbers. Obviously it's May. We still have, I think, quite a few months to look at whether or not border apprehensions will be dropping off. But I think this really points to the fact that people are fleeing pretty dire conditions. And in their mind and in their calculus, they would rather risk fleeing the conditions that they have in their countries, in Central America in particular, to come here, irrespective of the policy that's being adopted to deter that. And so it's going to be an open question as to really whether or not the administration's policy in the minds of the people who are fleeing and coming here outweigh the conditions that they have here. So it's, like I said, we don't really know yet, but it's going to be interesting to sort of see what happens with these figures over the next couple of months.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
That's our show for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and a special thanks to our producers, Emily Schrader and Ashley Swearingen. Please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time.